Hello, today we're going to talk about the human population demographics. And the human population is subject to all those same ecological principles that we talked about with other populations. So all of those things are going to come into play now. So if you look at the history of the human population, you'll see what we call that J curve, that exponential growth curve. It started off very small, but it very quickly started to double more and more. And there's a few things that are responsible for that. The incorporation of agriculture into society allowed people to stay in one place, and that allowed the populations to get bigger rather than hunting and gathering. And then the Industrial Revolution is when we saw the big jump upwards. So people were starting to live in cities. Economic growth helped the population to grow even further, and now we're experiencing a technological revolution that makes it continue to grow exponentially. So we are in this exponential growth pattern, which is unusual for a K strategist like ourselves. That's more common under those R strategist species. And now the question is, okay, everything at some point is going to reach a carrying capacity and start to level off. So at what point does the human population reach that, and what kind of impacts is that going to have on us? So if we talk about demography or demographics, basically we're talking about statistics that have to do with populations and what those statistics mean. So population size is a type of demographics. You can also look at different things like ethnicity, economic status, population density. Any kind of statistics that tell us about populations are called demographics. So one of the things that we can do here is these are our top 10 most populous countries in the world right now. And you can see a lot of this data is very, very recent. If you look at these, you can also compare their population densities, and you see that some places are much more densely populated than others. So this is really how many people are living in a square mile. And some of these numbers are really hard to picture because in the US, we have about 83 people living in a square mile. So if you think about, on average, a mile away from your house, if you're in kind of a suburb area, you probably have around 83 people in that square mile. Bangladesh, on the other hand, almost 3,000 people in that same amount of area. So you can kind of imagine how that impacts these populations. There's a couple terms that we need to know that go along with what we're going to talk about today. So one of them is replacement level fertility, and that's basically how many children a couple need to have to replace themselves. So you'd think that this would be 2. Since it's 2 people, they would need 2 children. But it's actually a little higher. It's around 2.1 because there are always going to be some children that will die before they can reproduce, and that skews it a little bit. Now, our actual worldwide fertility rate right now, which is basically how many children are born per woman, which you can kind of think of as per couple. It's really the woman that counts here since they're going to have the kid. But the average children born per woman is at 2.5. So you can see that our fertility rate is actually higher than our replacement level. And what that means is the population is growing. So when we look at these demographics, we're also going to be comparing developed versus developing countries. So these highly developed countries like us versus these less developed countries, those LDCs versus the HDCs. And some things that we're going to see across the board is there's generally a lot more growth in these LDCs. Their fertility rate is generally higher. They have more kids. Usually there's a lot of reasons behind that. They also have a higher infant mortality rate, though, when babies are dying very young. Lower life expectancies, so higher mortality rate overall. They make much less money overall. And one of the big things that goes along with a lot of these statistics in terms of fertility rate, birth rate, is how many women are using contraception. So you see that's way lower in developing countries as well. And when we look at these demographics, we're going to use a tool that's really helpful called an age structure diagram. These are also called population pyramids. And the way this works is it's showing you who's in the population, and there's a couple ways they do it. Sometimes they actually show you how many people. Sometimes they tell you the percent of the total population. And it splits it up so that it's a double bar graph. going either direction, and it shows you the male and the female. So one of the things you can see is, are the individuals in the population equally split between the genders? It also divides it up by age. And what's really helpful here is sometimes these will be shaded in 3 different categories. Those different categories are called the age structures of the population. So there are 3 major age structures that you need to know. Pre-reproductive years, which would be from 0 to about 14 years. It's about the earliest that most people could have children. Reproductive years, 15 to 44 years old on average, is when most people are able to reproduce. And post-reproductive years, which would be anybody who is no longer able to reproduce. And then the age structure of populations, all of these different things, and how many people are in each of these different categories, that gets determined by a couple different things: the natality or the birth rate, the mortality or the death rate, how long it takes to go through a generation, and also the sex ratios in the populations, because you're going to find that you don't always have an equal number of males and females. If you take a look at different countries, you're going to see different shaped pyramids. But in all of these cases, we can kind of divide them into these pre-reproductive, reproductive, and post-reproductive years. And we can use the patterns in here to tell us if that population is growing, staying the same, or starting to decline in number. So this can tell us a lot about populations. So the first pattern is called rapid growth. And I want you to make sure you're cutting and pasting your pictures here as well. So the rapid growth pattern looks like this. You have a very large base, so you have a lot of people in those pre-reproductive years and a good amount in the reproductive years too. And the more people you have down here towards the bottom, the more potential you have for this population to grow, because you have so many people who are going to be able to be having babies, and that's going to cause the population to grow. If you have this rapid growth, you will see that more people are down in this part than this part here. So right now in this particular graph, which is from Nigeria and Africa, 50% of the women about are at childbearing age, and 32% are younger than childbearing age. That means that in the coming years, up to 80% of this population is going to be able to have kids. If you look here, 46% of women are actually less than 15 years old at the moment. So that means all of those people could come up and have kids and add to the population. This is what we're seeing in many countries around the world. And if you look here, you can see kind of divided up by areas of the world who has a population that's mostly under age 15 and what percentage of those people are under age 15. And you can see that Africa has the highest group and therefore the highest potential for growth. But overall, in the world, 30% of our people are under reproductive age. They're in that pre-reproductive category. So we're going to see quite a bit of growth going forward here. You can see that these highly developed countries, which are mostly in North America and Europe, do have a much lower percentage of those younger people. So in some of these countries, they're not going to grow, or they might even decline. So this is what it looks like if you have a zero growth population pyramid. Basically, there's just as many people in the reproductive stage as you need to keep the population at the same amount. So countries that are experiencing this would be Denmark, Austria, Italy. So it's called zero growth. They're not getting bigger, but they're not getting smaller either. They're just maintaining their current status. Negative growth is going to look like the opposite pattern. So now, instead of your bottom area being the largest area, now it's the top. So most of your population in this situation has already passed their reproductive years. They can't have kids anymore. And because of that, your population is going to slow down. And there's not enough people coming up into those reproductive years to grow your population, so it's actually going to start to shrink. And this tends to happen in highly developed countries like Germany, Bulgaria, Hungary, places also that sometimes you'll see don't have the best economies will also often be a negative growth, or in some cases it is a good economy and people just don't need as many children. In the US, we are growing, but not by very much. However, the baby boomers are going to have a huge impact on the human population here. This was a group of people that were born when the soldiers came back from World War II, and there was a big baby boom. And you can see here that this is 1955. That's when that time period when a lot of these people were born. In 1985, a lot of them are starting to become parents because they're in their 20s and 30s. And now we're starting to see those people go into retirement and they're past their reproductive years. So this is really going to impact our Social Security and Medicare system going forward, because now we have this huge group of people who are going to be in that elderly category. All right, so just to remind you, rapid growth is going to look like this. Slow growth is still going to be heavier on the bottom, but it's going to go up more gradually than this one. And your zero growth looks very similar to kind of like a nose cone of a rocket. Negative growth, you see that opposite pattern where it's kind of top heavy instead. So there's a pattern that goes along with this in pretty much all countries will follow this progression through what we call a demographic transition, where they become more and more industrialized and more urbanized. And there's 4 stages to this pattern, and we can see them in these age structure diagrams also. So stage 1 is the pre-industrial stage. Those are those LDCs. They're not as developed. They're still more of an agricultural society. Then stage 2, you go into that transitional phase. They're moderately developed, and then they start to bring in the industrial phase, stage 3, and eventually once that is established, we would consider them a highly developed country, and they may even move into stage 4, which is post-industrial. So you can see kind of how these demographics change over these stages. The birth rate tends to steady off and then start to decrease as people don't need as many children. The death rate also starts to decrease because medicine and things like that get better, so you have fewer deaths. But the total population grows throughout this until you get to that post-industrial phase, and then it starts to go down again partly because people don't need as many children. So you need to know the characteristics of each stage. In that pre-industrial stage, living conditions are really severe. You don't have much medical care. You have a limited food supply. They're still pretty much growing their own food. So you have a really high birth rate because people have lots of kids in order to make up for that high mortality rate, and also to work on farms and things like that. So you have little to zero population growth during this stage because that mortality rate is so high. Many countries right now in Africa are experiencing this stage again, even though they had moved past it, because AIDS is taking them back to this level. Stage 2 is that transitional level, and it's when you've started to industrialize an area, so you're starting to get better medicine, better hygiene. The birth rate is no longer decreasing, and the death rate's starting to go down, so your population is starting to increase. And as you get improved sanitation, education, all of those things will start to bring your populations up. So India, Pakistan, and Mexico are all in stage 2 right now. Stage 3 is that industrial stage, and here we start to urbanize the society. So that urbanization, moving into cities, is going to start to decrease that advantage of having a large family. So now it's not going to be an advantage, it's going to be a cost. So parents are going to be discouraged from having large families because it costs so much. And also, women are starting to be educated here and given opportunities to work, and that also helps to decrease birth rates since they're in the workforce instead of just having children. And obtaining food at this point is no longer their major focus of every day. Leisure time is available. A lot of people can retire. They don't have to work their whole lives. So in response to all of these things, you start to see the birth rate dropping and the death rate leveling out. So your population starts to become more stable. So China is going through this right now. And then our stage 4 is post-industrial. At this point, your birth rates equal your mortality rates, so you have zero population growth. You might even start having negative population growth And this could be because the birth rate's actually going to fall below the mortality rate, the death rate. So Russia, Japan, many European countries, probably us too, would fall into this category. So what we're going to start looking at here is what's going to happen in the future because of these patterns. We have more and more LDCs that are becoming more highly developed, and how is that going to affect our human population? So come in ready to think about that tomorrow. Thanks, and see you later.